The Comstock Lode was real. The silver existed. The deposits were confirmed. The numbers, at least on paper, were extraordinary. For a time, it looked like one of the greatest mineral discoveries in American history. People came to Nevada with clear expectations, not dreams or rumors, calculations. They believed the scale of the discovery would translate directly into lasting wealth. Most of them were wrong. The silver was there, but it did not remain where the work was done, and for many who stayed, very little was left behind. At the time, the optimism seemed justified. According to contemporary reports, the Comstock produced vast quantities of silver and gold. Mining companies formed quickly. Capital flowed in from the East and from Europe. On the surface, it looked like success. But later records tell a quieter story. Rising costs, short working lives, and a growing gap between the value extracted and the lives it supported. The Comstock did not fail in the way people expected. It produced wealth, just not stability. So how did one of the richest mining discoveries of its time leave so little behind for those closest to it? And why did the promise of abundance translate into such uneven outcomes? The Comstock Lode was discovered in 1859 beneath the eastern slope of what is now Virginia City, Nevada. At first, it was mistaken for something smaller. Early miners believed they were dealing with a shallow gold deposit, similar to those found elsewhere in the West. Only after deeper digging did the scale of the discovery become clear. This was not a scattered vein. It was a massive, continuous body of ore, rich in silver and mixed with gold. News spread quickly, but not carelessly. Unlike many mining rumors, the Comstock was verified by repeated extraction. Samples were tested. Returns were measured. The figures held up. For investors and engineers, this changed everything. The Comstock required more than individual labor. It demanded shafts, pumps, mills, and coordinated work underground. This immediately pushed the operation beyond the reach of most independent miners. What had been discovered was not just mineral wealth, but a system that favored organization, capital, and distance from the ground itself. Virginia City expanded rapidly around this assumption. Infrastructure followed money. Banks, offices, and supply chains appeared almost as fast as the mines themselves. From the outside, the Comstock looked like progress. From below ground, it already felt different. The size of the discovery ensured attention, but it also ensured that control would concentrate quickly. And once that happened, the flow of wealth would follow a very specific path. From the beginning, access to the Comstock was uneven. The depth and complexity of the ore body meant that traditional surface claims were not enough. Reaching the silver required capital, engineering, and coordination. As a result, ownership consolidated quickly. Large mining companies acquired claims through purchase, legal maneuvering, or direct pressure. Independent miners, who might have succeeded elsewhere, found themselves excluded or absorbed. Control moved upward. Decisions were no longer made at the face of the rock, but in offices, boardrooms, and distant financial centers. Those who worked underground rarely owned what they extracted. They were paid wages, not shares. Their income depended on continued operation, not on the long-term value of the mines. This structure reshaped expectations. The Comstock was no longer a place where effort directly translated into reward. It became a system where labor sustained production, while value accumulated elsewhere. According to historical accounts, Many miners recognized this shift early, but by the time it became unavoidable, alternatives were limited. Leaving meant forfeiting income. Text staying meant accepting a narrower role in a much larger operation. The ground itself had not changed, but the relationship between people and the silver beneath it had. And once control concentrated, it rarely moved back. Mining the Comstock was never simple. As shafts went deeper, conditions became more difficult and more expensive to manage. Heat increased, water flooded tunnels, rock pressure intensified. Keeping mines operational required constant investment. Pumps had to be installed and maintained. Timber was needed to prevent collapses. Ventilation systems became essential for survival underground. All of this raised costs long before profits were guaranteed. For mining companies, these expenses were absorbed into balance sheets and long-term projections. Text for workers, they translated into longer hours and higher risk without proportional compensation. Returns fluctuated. Some sections of the lode produced extraordinary yields. Others produced far less than expected. This inconsistency made planning difficult and increased dependence on continuous extraction. Stopping work, even briefly, could mean financial collapse. As a result, pressure moved downward. Miners worked in dangerous conditions to keep operations viable. Injuries were common. Careers underground were often short. The silver continued to come out of the ground, but the margin between value and cost narrowed for those closest to the work. The Comstock did not stop producing wealth. It simply demanded more of it to continue, and the burden of that demand was not shared evenly. Text as silver production increased, so did the assumption that prosperity would follow it. In reality, the movement of wealth followed a different path. Much of the value extracted from the Comstock did not remain in Nevada. It flowed outward, toward investors, financiers, and industrial centers far from the mines themselves. Mining companies paid dividends to shareholders who had never seen the shafts. Banks financed expansion and collected interest regardless of outcomes underground. Equipment manufacturers profited from constant demand driven by technical difficulty. For local workers, this system offered stability only as long as extraction continued. Wages were fixed, risk was not. Even during periods of high output, miners rarely accumulated savings. Text living costs in boom towns were high. Work was uncertain. Contemporary financial records show that while the Comstock generated immense total value, that value concentrated rapidly away from the source. Virginia City thrived briefly as a hub of activity, but its prosperity depended on circulation, not accumulation. Money moved through the town rather than settling in it. This created a fragile economy. When production slowed or costs rose, there was little buffer. Workers were the first to feel the change. Businesses followed soon after. The Comstock produced silver on an unprecedented scale, but the structure surrounding it ensured that very little of that wealth remained where it was mined. For a time, the Comstock appeared unstoppable. New shafts were opened. Technology improved. Text output remained high enough to justify continued investment, but beneath the surface, the balance was shifting. As the richest sections of the lode were exhausted, remaining or became harder to access and less consistent. Each additional foot underground required more labor, more equipment, and more capital. The system depended on scale. Only continuous extraction could offset rising costs. Any slowdown threatened the entire operation. This created a fragile equilibrium. Mining companies pushed deeper and faster, not because conditions improved, but because stopping was no longer an option. Profit depended on momentum, not margin. For workers, this meant intensifying pressure. Shifts grew longer. Safety margins narrowed. Accidents increased. Text according to later accounts, the work became less about opportunity and more about endurance. Staying employed mattered more than advancement. Survival replaced ambition. The Comstock had not run out of silver, but it was running out of flexibility. Once production requires constant escalation to remain viable, decline becomes a matter of timing rather than discovery. And for the Comstock, that timing was approaching. When production on the Comstock began to slow, the change was not immediate or dramatic. Operations continued. Silver was still extracted, but the sense of inevitability disappeared. Mines that had once expanded aggressively became cautious. New investment slowed. Maintenance replaced growth. For workers, this shift was subtle but decisive. Text opportunities for advancement narrowed. Temporary layoffs became more common. Wages stagnated even as conditions underground remained demanding. Virginia City felt the change quickly. Businesses that depended on constant activity saw fewer customers. Housing emptied gradually. Speculation gave way to consolidation. The town did not empty overnight. It adjusted downward, one decision at a time. Some miners left for newer discoveries. Others stayed, hoping the downturn was temporary. Many had little choice but to remain until work ended. The Comstock still mattered economically, but it no longer shaped the future. What had once been a center of expansion became a place of continuation, working to sustain what already existed rather than build what might come next. Text, and once momentum is lost in a system built on scale, recovery becomes unlikely. With time, the Comstock Lode became easier to quantify than to interpret. The numbers were undeniable. Millions of dollars worth of silver and gold had been extracted. Records detailed production, dividends, and technological achievement. On paper, it looked like a success. But historical reassessment shifted focus away from totals and toward distribution. Later studies and accounts emphasized how little of that wealth translated into long-term stability for the region or its workforce. The mines had been productive. The system surrounding them had been extractive in more ways than one. Virginia City survived as a historical reference rather than an economic center. Text, the infrastructure built to support continuous mining had little use once expansion ended. What remained were traces, tunnels, equipment, records, rather than institutions that could adapt. The Comstock became an example often cited in discussions of industrial mining, not as a failure of geology or engineering, but as a case where scale overwhelmed sustainability. It demonstrated how abundance can accelerate depletion, not of resources, but of resilience. The silver was measurable. The cost was harder to record, and it took distance in time to see which one had lasted longer. Despite the rising costs and narrowing returns, many people remained tied to the Comstock longer than logic suggested. The reason was not ignorance, it was commitment. Text, by the time conditions worsened, miners had already invested years of labor underground. They had built routines, relationships, and identities around the work. Leaving meant more than changing jobs. It meant abandoning a life structure. There was also the persistent belief that improvement was possible. Production fluctuated. New sections occasionally yielded strong returns. Each partial recovery reinforced the idea that the worst might already be over. Contemporary letters describe this period not as desperate, but as uncertain. People did not feel defeated. They felt suspended. Breaking even became acceptable. Stability replaced ambition. Survival replaced accumulation. This psychological adjustment kept labor in place even as objective conditions declined. Text the Comstock did not force people out. It slowly reduced the reasons to stay. By the time departure felt unavoidable, alternatives were fewer. New discoveries were farther away. Competition was greater. Age and injury limited mobility. The cost of staying was not immediate. It was gradual, and that made it easier to accept until it was no longer reversible. The Comstock Lode reshaped mining in the United States long after its peak. It introduced large-scale industrial extraction as the dominant model. Engineering solutions developed there were reused elsewhere. Capital-driven mining became the norm rather than the exception. In that sense, the Comstock was influential, but influence did not mean benefit for those who worked within it. Text the system it normalized prioritized output over durability. Regions were developed to extract value, not to retain it. Workforces were treated as interchangeable components rather than long-term stakeholders. Nevada did not collapse after the Comstock slowed, but it did not retain the wealth that had passed through it either. The towns built around the lode adjusted downward, much like Columbia had earlier, not through disaster, but through irrelevance. What remained were lessons embedded in structure rather than policy. Large discoveries could generate enormous value while leaving little behind. Technological progress could coexist with personal precarity, and success, measured in totals, could mask instability at every other level. The Comstock did not end mining booms. Text it refined them, and in doing so, it made their outcomes more predictable. The Comstock Lode is remembered as one of the richest mineral discoveries in American history. That memory is accurate, but incomplete. The silver existed. The output was immense. The technology was advanced for its time. What was missing was permanence. Very little of the wealth created by the Comstock remained where it was extracted. It moved outward, upward, and away, following structures designed to transport value rather than anchor it. For those who worked underground, the legacy was not fortune, but fatigue. Short careers, limited savings, and towns that slowly outlived their purpose. The Comstock did not fail because the silver ran out. It failed to convert abundance into stability. Text its story reveals a recurring pattern. When wealth is measured only by volume and success only by extraction, what remains afterward is often less than expected. The Comstock left behind tunnels, records, and influence, but it did not leave behind a future for most of the people who built it. So much silver was taken from the ground, and yet so little was left where it mattered most. That is why the Comstock endures, not as a promise fulfilled, but as a reminder of how easily value can pass through a place without ever staying.